can compulsions and addictions be cured?
Let's start with compulsions, I guess, because everything that's true for compulsions is also true for addictions. Most compulsive behavior, let's say, I don't know, we're biting our nails, for instance, right? That's an example of a compulsive behavior that people try and stop that's not really an addiction. Usually it's when you stop a compulsion, it's because you're substituting it for a different compulsion. So we have to be aware that that's usually the case. So instead of biting your nails, you're doing something else. You're using a fidget spinner or, something, right?
Yeah, so replacing one action with another action.
Yeah, but compulsively. Replacing one compulsive action with a different compulsive action. So we have to be aware that that's usually what we do and what people do. And so, the first step to break, and by the way, I can't claim that I have achieved this fully. I'm good with addictions. Compulsions, as I said, I'm not an enlightened or awakened person, so I can only give a general guide. I certainly haven't managed it totally by any means. But my understanding of what's involved, first of all, becoming more aware. And as I said, everything I'm about to say will apply to any addiction too. So the first thing is becoming more aware. So rather than doing things on autopilot, not trying to change anything, just, every morning I brush my teeth before I comb my hair. Or every time I sit down on the sofa, I sit on the left side or whatever, right? Every time I have a coffee, I put 2 sugars and, this much milk in it. So just becoming aware of what you do is the first thing, and actually seeing the compulsiveness. Because I have made this statement, most of us are walking around, in a compulsive trance-like state most of the time. You might go, yeah, that sounds true. But that doesn't really mean very much. It's actually seeing it for yourself is crucial. I mean, an example for that applies to me that is the case in this medium is what I just did, right? Like saying all those kind of things. Those are compulsive phrases that I keep saying that often usually don't really help, and yet I just do it, right? That my higher self, as I talked about at the beginning, my part of me that knows what's best to me, knows that that's not a good idea. People don't really like it, especially when it's a lot, but I just do it anyway because for whatever reason it feels good to do what's familiar, right? So that's an example of it. So if I want to stop that and I'm working on that and I've made some progress, first step is to become aware that I'm doing it at all, right? And not becoming aware in general, like you telling me when you say a lot, but for me to realize in the moment, I just did it again. I just said again. I just did it again. That's the crucial thing. So it's becoming aware specifically, not becoming aware generally. Actually watching yourself do it. That's the first thing. And that is like a very profound practice in a way. That's building awareness, which leads us into the next thing, which is practicing awareness. So practicing presence, which is often called meditation, right? So doing some kind of meditative practice, not the kind of meditation where you kind of check out, tune out, and listen to some kind of guided visualization thing. I'm not against that, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking more about like a mindfulness meditation or a meditation where you become aware of your breathing, meditation where you become aware of your body, like yoga nidra, something would it be
kind of like practicing focusing on something specific, or is this something slightly different?
No, you're right. I mean, practicing on focusing something specific is a great way of realizing how unpresent you are. This is something that I used to do when I used to do more advanced yoga practices. So a great example of this, Chris, that you can try, anyone listening to this right now can try, is this. Find a spot on the wall or in the ceiling that you can look at comfortably without craning your neck like I'm doing now, right? And then just stare at it and do whatever you can to stop your awareness drifting away. And it will drift away in 2 different ways at least. First, it will drift away in terms of, you going to a kind of daydream, a waking dream. Secondly, it will drift away in terms of, I might start looking over there, or, there's a fly has just gone past and now I'm following the fly instead of staring at what I'm supposed to be, right? If you are really, really relentless about this, and I'm going to talk more about that in a second, you will find, and I guarantee this, if you're relentless enough, you will start hallucinating full-blown more than you will with LSD or, mushrooms, maybe as much as you would with something like DMT, just by trying to stare at a dot. It turns out, and I learned this from one of my spiritual teachers early on, he said that focus is such a difficult thing that like sometimes God Almighty himself will come along to like distract you from doing it. It's actually amazing what you can experience when you just relentlessly try and focus on one point. So the visual one I found to be more effective. Some people do an auditory version of that, right? They'll just keep repeating a mantra, the same thing to themselves, om, om, or whatever, right? That's trying to achieve the same thing. That's not as amazing because having auditory hallucinations is not such a big deal compared to visual hallucinations. Are very, shocking to most people, but it's actually the same thing. If you obsessively, relentlessly try and keep focusing on the same sound, you will also start hearing weird sounds and stuff like that come up in an attempt to distract you from it. So that's not an easy thing to do to get to that, but I'm saying if you really, really, really carry on and not give up, it doesn't take long. It takes minutes of absolute fixed point concentration. That's what it's called, fixed point concentration.
What's going on internally that's causing you to see different things than just the spot on the wall?
I don't know if it's really been looked at neurologically, but my simple understanding of it is that it's that thing about avoiding presence again. Like your body will do anything to avoid presence. I think there's other spiritual factors going on with that, but I would be going well into the realm of, talking about something different and also speculating. So I'll leave it at that. It's just like some part of your mind's attempt to distract you from being present. Let's just put it that way. And so you will never be able to stare at the dot, let's say for 10 minutes without being distracted by something, whether it's moving your eyes or a hallucination or daydreaming or whatever. But the attempt of doing it repeatedly and the attempt of sitting down quietly and watching your breath for 20 minutes or whatever it might be, any of those practices will develop a skill which is absolutely extremely useful when it comes to addiction, and it's absolutely crucial if it comes to compulsions, which in a way compulsions are weaker than addictions because an addiction is just a compulsion plus a biochemical issue imbalance. But in another way, being free of all addictions is way easier than being free of all compulsions, right? Because compulsions is such an intricate part of our life. So it's easier to give up a particular compulsion than a particular addiction, but it's very, very difficult to give up all compulsions more than all addictions. So, but the thing that makes it possible is the next step. So if you do this practice, so you do like control of breath is another thing, often called pranayama. So you become aware of your breath, you become conscious of your breath. Often, doing practices to control your breath, so 4 seconds in, hold for 4 seconds, 4 seconds out. We're doing an episode, or I've done an episode soon about, different breathing practice, Buteyko, where again, in that one, you're holding your breath as long as possible. So that again requires a very high amount of presence, because if you snap out of being present for even a second, you will compulsively breathe because it's what you want to do, right? So any practice like that, getting into cold water is another example, and something that Wim Hof talks about as being, very powerful, and he's proven this in the lab of, getting you into a meditative state actually more powerfully than most, or maybe all, systems of meditation. So absolutely sitting and focusing, absolutely sitting and not necessarily focusing, but just attempting to be aware and not distracted. Absolutely breathing control, pranayama. Absolutely fixed point concentration with your eyes, or fixed point concentration with a sound. Those are all what they all have in common, other than like they won't get you to being fully present forever until that moment of enlightenment, but they will build a habit of being present, just as we talked about earlier about how it's all down to biochemical realities and the neurological habits. So rather than going down the compulsion neurological pathway, you'll start going down the presence neurological pathway more. But there is another benefit other than that. And it's the benefit that the term that I first heard was unbending intent, or otherwise known as true will. So the thing about being an addict is that you do not have this. You do not have unbending intent, inline will, or true will. You have a very bending intent and a very weak will, right? And how do I define that? I'm not saying that all addicts are weak-willed people, because I know some alcoholics, for instance, are, very can be very disciplined, very successful in their career or in their, sporting endeavor or whatever it might be. So I'm not saying that you are completely weak-willed, but what I am saying is this quality of unbending intent or true will, the crucial thing about it is that it can be applied to anything, not just a specific thing. So what you tend to find is that people are very brave, very disciplined, very aware, etc., within their specific niche, right? So maybe they're really good in relationships, maybe they're really good in, exercise, maybe they're really good in their career, maybe they're really good in, this or that, sports or whatever, right? But the problem is they can't carry that over. One of my friends is always saying this. He's been saying it for years. He goes, I can't understand that this person can be so successful and yet so lazy with this, or so kind of stupid with this, how someone is so, they're a top athlete and yet they can't keep their, what in their pants, or how they're a top business person and they can't make themselves, and they can't stick to a healthy diet or something like that, right? It's and that's because they may have willpower and discipline and all the rest of it in a niche, but it's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about unbending intent. I'm talking about true will. That can be applied in any place. And so
I was going to say, so that you're talking about that being across the board, like in every area of your life.
Yes. And and so I relate it to this issue of actually integrity. So these are the next notes that I made. I believe that one of the things that you have to do is learn to value integrity and truth. And so, and see that as a really high value. You may not keep that as a high value for all your life. Maybe you'll end up doing something else. But if you're in that phase of needing to break out of compulsions and addictions, I believe that you have to start valuing that very highly. Everyone knows that every addict is dishonest, right? That's just a tendency. That's one of the other, I know the famous TV doctor, Dr. Drew, he talks about his definition of addiction. And one of them is, if you feel the need to hide it, right? If you're honest about it and it's no big deal and you can freely talk about it with anyone, you don't keep it a secret or hide it, then that's an indicator to him that it's not an addiction by his definition, right? So there is a tendency to dishonesty, even if it's just hiding and withholding and, stuff like that, even if it's not active lying. And so, but often it is active lying, right? For various different ways. With any serious addiction, it certainly is. Well, as much as addicts may be dishonest with other people, either by omission or active deceit, the person they're most dishonest with is themselves. If you think about it, like a smoker, how many times does a smoker that has said to you that they're going to quit and not do it? Well, they said it to themselves 10 times more often, and this goes, and I'm talking more about addictions now, but it goes for compulsions, right? It's like, let's say you want to get up in the morning and you want to run or walk or do exercise, right? And then you wake up the next morning, or maybe, you want to get up earlier. You want to get up at 6 a.m. so you have time to do that. Or you want to get up in the morning to do meditation because you just heard this episode or whatever, right? And then it actually comes to it and you're like, ugh, I don't really want to do it, right? The person last night who said they wanted to exercise or meditate this morning is not the same person as this morning. That person wants to go back to sleep, right? That person wants to go back to bed. And, ditto, the person who says, I'm not going to drink tonight is not the same person that night who's, actually, I really would like a drink, right? So now, of course, it is the same person, but I'm saying it's experienced as being a different person. And so that discordance between that you at lunchtime who said to a colleague, I won't drink tonight, and then in the evening who's actually says, actually go on then, or that difference between the person at night who says, I'm going to get up early tomorrow and do a meditation, and then that person in the morning who doesn't do it. Every time you lie to yourself like that, people act as if it's no big deal. It's a big deal.
Right.
It means that you have no integrity with yourself. It means that you have no trust with yourself. It means that your word to yourself means nothing. And people really miss the boat to me with this issue, big time. And I'll give an example of it. Let's say that you promised yourself you're going to do something today. And then someone comes along and says to you, I need help with something. If your tendency, your compulsion, let's say, I know everything is on a case-by-case basis, but if you compulsively help them because they need help, for instance, that feels like you're being a good person. But what that's also actually doing is ruining your own integrity and trust with yourself. And it's also destroying that quality, which I'm calling unbending intent, which is I'm just going to do it, or I'm just going to not do it, either way, right? Why? Because I said so, and that's it. That's the attitude of unbending intents. No excuses, no ifs, ands, buts, maybes, right? This is a lot of the time what's called a disciplined attitude, but I'm trying to distinguish it from discipline because I realize there's a lot of people who are disciplined in certain areas, but not universally. And so this is what I mean about it being universal, is it's your word to yourself. And a lot of people will, I would say it's more important to keep your word to yourself, even if you're in a situation, let's say you told yourself, you know, tomorrow morning I'm going to meditate, but you told someone else tomorrow morning I'm going to pick you up and drive you to the airport. I actually believe, again, maybe not in all phases of your life, but in a I'm trying to break out of addictions and compulsion phase of your life, that promise to yourself is actually more important than that promise to the other person, right? Unless that person really is more important to you than you, for whatever reason, maybe they save your life, maybe they're your parent or they're your child or something like that, right? But I'm saying, like, you're still telling yourself that person and my word to them is more important than my word to me. That's still the side effect of that, even though it is understandable.
Let me ask you this, because just something popped into my head. Let's say you did make that decision. You're at lunch. You made that decision. I'm not going to drink tonight. A friend who you haven't seen in 5 years flies in, surprises you and say, hey, let's go out for a drink tonight because I'm probably not going to see you for another 5 years. Then what would somebody do? Are they still then, not valuing that integrity of that decision that they made earlier? Or is it a different situation because there's new information that they had? I'm just throwing that out there to see where that lands.
Well, like I said, it has to be taken on a case-by-case basis if you're a truly present person. Otherwise, you're being compulsive again. However, the point of this is actually less to be very rigid, which I think is what you're pointing to as a potential downside. The point is actually much more to be careful what you tell yourself and what you promise yourself.
Very good point. Very good point. Especially if you tell yourself consistently, I'll get up and I'll do it tomorrow. I promise I won't have that ice cream or this and that, but you are continually breaking your word to yourself on those points.
Absolutely. And that's where I said earlier that you have to learn to value truth and honesty and integrity as a virtue in and of itself, right? Not, specifically for this reason, so you can start to build up this quality of trust in yourself again, so that you believe your word. I mean, integrity is a funny word. I think all kinds of virtues are attached to it, but the simplest definition I've heard of it is just, I do what I say I will do. That's it. Now, there can be some flexibility around it. Like, for instance, I don't think it's necessarily a good idea to say, I will get up tomorrow at 6 a.m. and meditate no matter what, because something might stop you. But I think what could work is I will meditate for 20 minutes every day no matter what. Even if everything stops you throughout the day, crisis to crisis to crisis, demand, 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 demand. Eventually you end up in bed ready to sleep, and then you do 20 minutes of meditation before you fall asleep. Do you see what I mean? Like, there's always a way. If you are committed and if you have integrity enough with yourself that you are true to your word. And that's that quality of unbending intent. But as I say, to just try and shift into that is difficult, which is why I mentioned all the practices earlier. If you practice controlling your breath, if you practice controlling your focus, if you practice fixed point concentration, if you practice being more aware of your body and staying present, it will be much, much easier to stick to your word. Because if you don't practice those things, if you don't practice the more active things like fixed points concentration, then it will be too easy to bend and just go along with. And if you don't practice the awareness aspect, it'll be too easy to find yourself doing it and you don't even know it happened, right? Like, hasn't this happened all the time? Especially, I think with food, it's very common. I'm not going to eat that. And, oh my God, what am I doing? You know, like, and people do that with actually all kinds of things. People do that, with smoking, drinking. People do it with sex. Oh, I ended up in bed with, I ended up cheating on my wife or husband again. You know, it's like, how does that happen, right? People do even the most elaborate things compulsively and unconsciously, and then afterwards go, what the hell happened? I didn't even realize I was doing it. So that combination of the awareness plus the ability to really unbendingly stick with something is extremely valuable. Now, it is so valuable that a person can overdo it. As you mentioned earlier, you can be too rigid. You can become compulsive about being unbending. But then you are like using your keys that you could be using to free yourself to, in fact, lock yourself in, right? It's creating more of a problem.
Yes, it's like when somebody's too extreme with something, the longevity of that is not going to last. It's not going to be sustainable.
I agree, but the important distinction is, because a lot of people would say, saying you're going to do something every day or every week or whatever, no matter what, they would say that is too extreme, right? And so I would say the distinction around it is, be flexible about the how, but be unbending about the what. So if it's like it has to be at this time, at this person, in this situation, this, then often there'll be a reason you can't do it, and then you've just ruined your reputation with yourself again, because you've broken your word to yourself. Mm-hmm. But if you're smart about it, and you're like, at some point every day I'll do this, or at some point I will, or let's say it's a bigger goal, I want to lose 100 pounds of weight or whatever, right? If it's like I want to lose 100 pounds in 90 days, or whatever we consider healthy, a year or whatever. If it's, let's say 6 months, if it's, I want to lose 100 pounds in 6 months, and I will do it no matter what, you might end up in hospital because you're overdoing it, trying to reach a certain deadline, right? But if you're like, I am going to lose 100 pounds no matter what, and you mean it, but there's no time limit on it, then you can do it in a safe, healthy, non-compulsive way. You can keep taking actions that will lead you towards that outcome, but without being rigid, without being compulsive, without making things worse.
Wonderful, Owen. This is really good.
And I know that attitude of I will do it no matter what scares a lot of people. They immediately go into, oh, but what about this? What about that? And I would say that is the addict speaking. And it's the addict compulsive thing, right? Because it's the same thing if you smoke, or if you drink and then you say I'm not going to drink anymore. It's like, but what are you going to do with someone off drink? And what about Christmas? And what about when you feel really lonely? And what about if you're depressed? And what about if this? And what about if that? Right? That's the addict's mind speaking, trying to tell you that you can't do this thing. Well, there is a force, and I don't want to go into it. You kind of tried a little bit earlier, maybe we'll do it in a different episode, but there is a force that is trying to keep you from being this present, fully actualized, awakened, whatever you want to call it, person, right? And so to me, that force is that voice. What about this? What about that? What about that? Don't be present. Don't develop an unbending intent, don't become fully in the flow of life. Like all the reasons. What about if you're suffering too much? You don't want to be present because what about if this really painful feeling comes up? Like that's the whispering of the little devil in your ear to me. That's understandable and normal, but it's not helping you. And so that leads me to my last point. And I mentioned this in the previous episode as well. And so I'll get into this a little bit. I think addictions and compulsions are in a way a symptom of avoiding pain, like we've talked about. Mm-hmm. But another way of looking at it is that they are actually a symptom of a lack of a connection to a higher, bigger principle than self. And so, we have a kind of epidemic in that. Not only do we have the biggest human population, as far as we know, ever, but we have the biggest percentage of the human population ever that does not have a sense of connection to a higher principle.
And when you say a higher principle, what are you specifically speaking of?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, and this is a very important distinction. So throughout most of history, that higher principle would be either religious or spiritual. It would be, God, either God as a more abstract thing, like, a father in the sky or in heaven or something like that, or it would be more animist, pantheist, kind of like nature all around us, right? So the thing bigger than me is, the ocean, which is vast. The thing bigger than me is the forest. It's, beyond my comprehension. The thing bigger than me is the stars, right? Like they're infinite. I don't understand, So it's that kind of thing. But we have to understand that we look at the stars and go, okay. Or maybe start naming them and stuff like that. But, someone a few thousand years ago looks at the stars like, whoa, like, wow, what is that? That's like a huge mystery. And that's why, correctly or not, they created astrology and, myths, and they saw them as various gods and deities and all the rest of it, because that to them was like a transcendent thing. That's something bigger than them. And I would say, a lack of connection to those kind of things is part of the problem. If you live in a big city, you never see a vast expanse in front of you. That doesn't help the situation. That makes it easier to get into a narcissistic state of feeling like the whole world revolves around you, which we all start off feeling that way. Some of us grow out of it, some of us don't, to various different degrees. But I would say that's probably always been the case. But we've had, so both the physical reality of nature and then also a belief system, a religion, right? For a lot of people, throughout a lot of history, I believe it's ancestor worship, right? What I want right now is not nearly as important as all the ancestors that made my life possible. It's as simple as that, right? And so and I think this is still true for a lot of cultures in this world to this day, that they don't become, heroin addicts, or they don't become various things that are seen as, sinful or whatever. In most cultures, I realize not in ours right now, because that would bring too much shame upon their ancestors. So the thing bigger than them is just, and I'm talking about ancestors like people who died, but another example
lineage.
Lineage. But another example is just the extended family, right? Mm-hmm. That's another example of something bigger than yourself that will stop a lot of people getting into addictions. Now, a lot of time people have the addiction anyway and hide it from the family, or maybe everyone in the family has the addiction. And I think that is the problem. So nation state is another one. Nationalism is out now as a thing. Mm-hmm. You're not supposed to be proud of your country. You're not supposed to identify with your country. So my understanding is, though, the more limited it gets, the worse it gets. So if the thing bigger than yourself is just your family, then all your family might be addicts, right? That's not helping, If it's just your village or your town or whatever, then that's bigger still, but that's still quite limiting, and your country, or, a certain philosophy, like I'm a communist or I'm a fascist or whatever, like all of these things are quite limiting. And then the best thing is something that's infinite, something that's eternal, right? Which we would often call either religious or spiritual. If you have an experience of feeling a connection with, or an awareness of, the infinite, which again are the kind of experiences that you can have quite easily if you follow all the techniques that I shared for developing awareness and developing unbending intent, then that feeling of connection to something greater than yourself will often be very helpful for overcoming an addiction. And that's why it is one of those 12 steps, to be aware of what they call a higher power. Now, seeing yourself in context maybe with something greater than yourself is one thing, but obviously that on its own can just leave you feeling small and meaningless. And so, and that can again lead to a tendency for compulsion and addiction. So the other thing I feel is crucial is to find and then actually feel on a moment-to-moment basis a higher meaning for your own life. And I really feel that is the reason why we have such an addiction epidemic at the moment, you know. I mean, it's opiates especially, but, you know, it's amphetamines and it's all the rest. And if you want to look at the milder drugs, it's certainly caffeine for almost everyone. It's, you know, media or social media for almost everyone. So almost everyone is in this addictive and compulsive state. And I believe one of the reasons is because we don't feel like our lives have a profound meaning or purpose in the right way. When I say in the right way, well, we just talked about narcissism, and that's in the wrong way. If you feel like God has chosen you, or whatever, some higher force has chosen you and made you special and better than everyone else, that's not necessarily going to help you. But if you feel like I have a purpose that is meaningful, given to me by a force greater than myself. So does everyone else. So it doesn't make me better than or, you know, superior to anyone else. But I have that and I feel it and I'm connected to it on a moment-to-moment basis. Then the feelings that come up during my life, during my day, during this moment, the temporary feelings, the sadness, the disgust, the shame, the guilt, whatever is feelings that are, you know, so bad that they can be unbearable, are no longer unbearable because I have that context. First of all, the context of there's something greater than myself that's maybe benevolent. I guess that's an important part of it. And then the other thing is, this is only temporary. I have a purpose that is beyond this. The reason why sadness can become despair, or the reason why anger can become rage, or the reason why fear can become terror or paranoia, or the reason that disgust can become, you know, just like a hatred for the whole world, is because of that lack of awareness of a bigger purpose and a bigger context, right? So if it's like, I'm on a mission from God, again, doesn't make me special, doesn't make me different from anyone else, but I'm on a mission from God, and now I'm upset, now I'm sad, now I'm afraid, that's like a bump on the road. That's a, like with the meaning of it, that's a challenge, that's a trial, that's a tribulation, you know, like the old myths, right, of the gods or the half gods, like overcoming, you know, the Hercules and his 12 tasks, you know, Jesus and his going to the desert and being tempted by the devil, you know, all of that kind of thing. I'll give you an example for me, you know, because I do this, if I have some issue come up with health or someone else does, rather than feeling upset or sad and despair, I'm like, oh, I've been given this for a reason. And the reason is so I can learn about it and overcome it and share it with others. So that's a practical example of what I'm talking about, right? So rather than being something that's unbearable and I'm resentful against God for giving this to me, or against life for giving it to me, and I'm confused and, you know, in feeling of chaos because I don't understand it, and I'm afraid of what it might mean, and I'm angry that I have to deal with it, or frustrated I have to deal with it. Rather than all of that stuff, it's actually just a challenge that God has given me in the positive sense to overcome. You know, it's almost, again, a little bit biblical, like, you know, the kind of Lot attitude, you know, that everything, or was it Job? Sorry, I'm no Bible expert. That every bad thing that's put in front of me has a meaning. And that is something that I have practiced for a long time, funnily enough, ever since I stopped being an addict. Is that everything that comes up, I don't necessarily say to myself, God has given this to me for a reason. What I do is I ask, what is the purpose of this? What is the reason for this? So I assume that there is one, and I ask what it is.
Yeah, there's an opportunity here. There's a deeper meaning behind it for me, for something. Maybe I don't know it yet, but it will become, that awareness will come to me in time.
Yes, but I would recommend more proactively, what is it? Because then that it gives your mind something to focus on.
Right.
And maybe it's a distraction technique, I don't know. But I feel like to find that meaning is important, because then, as I said, you don't need to escape the feeling anymore.
No, absolutely. Yeah. So with these that you've put in front of us, the awareness, the practicing awareness, the unbending intent, and then, the connection with a higher principle. Once somebody's working on this, has this, what happens next?
Magic. I mean, honestly, the whole course of my life, I was, an addict, in debt, minimum wage job, no social life, no sense of purpose, no nothing before I took on all this. And my life changed so radically as a result of taking all this. If I were in a bit of a disassociated moment, I could go, I don't even know if any of this is real, because it's so radically different from how things were before. No, it's not perfect, but I feel like it has gone from like a mechanistic nightmare to, let's just say, an adventure, right? Not always positive, maybe, but it's something that I'm happy to be part of most of the time, and begrudgingly willing some of the time, as opposed to before, where it was just this grim slog. And yes, I know when consciously, a lot of people may not feel that it's a grim slog while they're in the middle of an addiction. But hedonism, so that's the pursuit of pleasure. If you remember, I said near the beginning that, compulsion is essentially not listening to the voice about my, higher purpose, and just listening to what's going to make me feel good now. So what's going to feel good now is hedonism. And hedonism seems appealing, and it's made to look appealing by certain, media and maybe even people in your life and stuff like that. And of course, the high of hedonism is very enjoyable if the alternative is just, dull, boring, or unpleasant suffering, which is what a lot of people live. But hedonism to me is really characterized by the lows, not the highs, different. I think the movie Trainspotting is a good example of that. Requiem for a Dream, I think, is another good example of that. Like the highs are relatively short-lived with a hedonistic lifestyle before long. And that's, because of biochemical, neurochemical realities, as well as maybe spiritual principles. But it's not easy to see through that if the alternative is just, like a dull, boring life or a life of suffering. And so you really need that connection to a higher power, to a transcendent purpose, I would say. And yeah, life is completely unrecognizable. Now, here's the other interesting thing. Once you develop unbending intent and you can apply it to anything, you can actually excel in any area where you have a genuine desire to. So let's say you really, really want to be a musician, but you never learn how to do it. Now you'll be able to do it, because the only thing that's stopping you being a musician, other than maybe a very low level of innate talent, is actually that you didn't have the discipline to practice and persist, despite probably not being very good to begin with, right? But now if you apply your newly developed unbending intent to it, you can become at least a pretty good musician, maybe an absolutely amazing musician, right? And that's true for any other skill. You want to become good with the opposite sex, you want to make money, you want to, go and help a load of people in charitable endeavors, you want to, sculpt the perfect body, whatever it is that you want to do. Certainly in terms of that kind of stuff, superficial stuff, and even in terms of profound stuff like we've talked about, maybe like spiritual advancement or, virtue cultivation, if you want to look at it from a more religious point of view, that all can come about as a side effect of unbending intent. I think that's the interesting thing. If your goal is to have unbending intent so that you can get rich, for instance, or so you can get, the relationship of your dreams or whatever, it doesn't actually work that well necessarily. Sometimes it does, but it's very unreliable, even if miraculous things happen sometimes. But if you develop unbending intent as a desirable thing, a virtue in and of itself, you can then apply it to everything else. Do I think that I've got an amazing unbending intent? No. But I do think the degree to which I developed it helped me to profoundly shift my life from, as I said, something very miserable and something very boring to something that a lot of people would, envy. So I don't think you have to be, perfect, and I don't think you have to be world-beatingly impressive, and you just apply it to the areas where, and again, this is the thing, you might meet people like with the Buddha, like he's overweight, and it's like, why is he overweight? Well, there's this example of that, right? If you're so this, then why that? And I think part of it is back to, as I just said, that higher purpose, that higher meaning that you have. When you have the unbending intent, you're still only going, if you're sensible, you're only going to apply it to the areas that the higher power you're connected to desires you to. And so, you might still be overweight. It's possible, although I wouldn't expect you to be very overweight, because if you are, then eventually it's going to reduce your ability to be effective and do your purpose. But
take you out of balance.
Yeah. But to a certain degree, do you see what I mean? You can be imperfect in all kinds of ways, and it doesn't necessarily mean you don't have that quality. So don't be fooled by that, because you'll really just apply it to the areas that are truly meaningful to you. Like an advanced theoretical physicist, for instance, may not be good in lots of areas, but it's because they only care about one thing. How you distinguish that from someone who's unable to apply it to anything else is, of course, very tricky. But it's not that tricky if you know them for a while, because here's the key thing, right? So let's say you have someone in your life and they get to a certain point and then they have a crisis, right? They have a health crisis, they have a career crisis, they have a money crisis, they have a social crisis, whatever it may be. If they can't apply unbending intent to resolving that issue, then they don't have it. So that's how you know if it's a choice or not. So someone may be overweight and, really have unbending intent because they're just choosing not to prioritize it. But if they, have a heart attack or something like that, and they still are not prioritizing it, even though it's stopping them being able to do their work, then you know that they don't actually have it. Or then you know that you don't actually have it if you're not sure if you have it. So that's, the only way to really, really tell, because it doesn't make you perfect. Being enlightened doesn't make you perfect. You can see that in the people who claim to be enlightened, who you believe in. But it gives you the option of developing any area if it truly is, part of your purpose in life. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that clip from the Rejuvenate podcast. If you want to watch the full episode that came from, just click on the link above. Or if you just want to watch our latest video, then click the link below. And make sure that you subscribe to the channel and like the video. Thank you.